tier list. We'll call this tier Christopher Columbus. Because, brother, you have just discovered a new way to troll my match. These are worse than bulk piles. Don't need this. Almost viable, viable, S tier. Aliens. Now this is going to surprise a lot of people, but aliens are better than you think. Cosmic Golgar can loop Swords of Revealing Light. 2600 is a very relevant stat line, and one of them Columbus. Moving on, we have Amaryllis. Now, Amaryllis is a viable deck. Multiple copies of Titanial can be problematic for a lot of decks. They got Mark of the Rose, which is extra copies of Rain Control. And this deck does perform better in person because of time rules. Shuffling takes longer, siding takes longer. The problem with this deck is that it will lose to itself. Your bricks are atrocious, and with the prevalence of Blackwings, you do not want to be summoning monsters with 0 defense into Shura, Bora, Kalut, Armed Wing. Yeah, that's a recipe for disaster, but I think it is viable. Not S tier though. Speaking of Blackwings, we got Blackwing Hybrid. You can put ketchup on an A5 Wagyu steak, but that doesn't mean you should. Like, Blackwings teeter a very fine line between being the most broken deck you've ever seen and being completely fucking useless. Somebody looked at the Blackwing brick hands and said, you know what I need? Dark Grepher. Oh, I got 15 hammers in my toolbox? You know what I need? How about 5 more hammers? And Dark Grepher. When you win with this deck, you're winning because of the Blackwings, not because of Dark Grepher. Viable. Blackwing Pure. They don't play Dark Grepher. Now, of the S tier decks, this is the easiest to pilot. They have some of the best trap mix-ups in the game. Not too many fancy combos. Darkram Dragon, Whirlwind, your nut hands are pretty much unlosable. They're almost unlosable. This is my recommendation for new players. Chainburn. Chainburn is almost viable. Now, this deck would be viable if Blackwings weren't a thing. Icarus Attack ruins your day, and you're also missing some tools like One Day of Peace, which comes out after Edison format. You can definitely take some games off of viable decks for sure. Dark Calling. This is almost viable. Now, of the meme decks, this deck will take matches off of S tier decks the most frequently. The whole game plan is to vomit out your hand and pray that it sticks, and yeah, it will sometimes stick. Fuck this deck. Disaster Dragons. This is pure dragons. They have sack potential with Future Fusion, but yeah, if I wanted a more... Yeah, they lose to frogs. Diva Frog. I believe that of the frog variants listed, this is probably the worst frog variant, so you should probably pick another option. But with that being said, it does have the frog engine, and frogs are just broken. The problem with this deck is that it loses extra hard to cards that you're already weak to, like Pulling the Rug or Deck Devastation Virus or Royal Oppression. This is not what you want versus Blackwings. Like, they have a huge impact on the meta. Diva Hero Beat. Now, this deck used to be a lot more prevalent back when people were still, learning the format. They have very explosive openings if you can protect a level 4 for 1 turn. Diva plus Miracle Fusion into Bryonac, and that's 7,900 points of damage. But its problems are pretty bad. You can brick with all monsters, you can brick with unusable Gemini Spark and Hero Blast. It does have a good matchup into Blackwings though, because Honest runs over Kalut, your monsters are just bigger, and Absolute Zero is a nightmare for Blackwings. Diva Hero is one of the most explosive decks in the format. They love to synchro summon, special summon a bunch of stuff, vomit out their hand and pray that it kills you, and the problem with this deck is that it will often run out of gas. But hey, Absolute Zero is a pretty good card. It can play Darkram Dragon, it can play Future Fusion, Mind Control, Return from the Different Dimension, DDV. This deck is extremely weak to Royal Oppression, but the high rolls are very high. The low rolls are very low. If you can avoid bricking and floodgates, you will blow people up. Diva Zombie. Diva Zombie is like a slower version of Diva Hero. Like, they're pretty similar in that they both have very heavy combos, but Diva Zombie is much slower early game, but more consistent and better late game, which changes the matchups that you're good versus and bad versus. For instance, Diva Hero is a lot better versus frogs than Diva Zombie, but Diva Zombie is better versus Vayu Turbo than Diva Hero. So it's an interesting trade-off. Like, whatever suits your style, both decks have seen success, so that is a viable deck. Dragon Control. Now, this deck is a deck that plays Red Med, it plays Wyvern, Caius, Hamster, Raikou. It can definitely sack the shit out of you. Yeah, this is a different version of Vayu Turbo. I think it's a little underrepresented, but it's definitely a very scary deck. Dragon Turbo, nobody likes to play versus it says bingo, bango, pew, 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 pew. But with that being said, it doesn't look like it takes much skill to play, but it actually does take a decent amount of skill to play. You have to know how much damage you can take before you decide to flip your Reckless Greed. The difference between Ghost Rider 15 and some random Dragon Turbo player is night and day. This deck is underrepresented, and I'm very happy because it's very frustrating to play versus. It is an S tier deck despite its low representation. Fairy Chaos, this is probably the best Recruiter Fairy version. They have access to Caius the Shadow Monarch, which means that you don't auto-lose to a dupe block. Like, I was playing Fairies once, and the guy made a dupe block, and I decked out. Like, Fairy Chaos can also play Royal Decree. They have Honest, so they have a pretty decent matchup versus Blackwings. But you'll get hands of 3 or more normal summons at a much higher frequency than other decks. consistently not having the option to use all of your cards on a turn hinders this deck. Very pure. Now, I don't understand what it is with this deck, but the people who play this are all in a fucking cult, I swear to God. They will tell you this is the best deck you should play. Oh my God, amazing, high skill cap, but this deck is one of the weakest to Dupe Frog in the game. It's one of the weakest to Super Nimble Hamster, and those are very common cards. It has 0 kill pressure early game. You're limited to 1 normal summon a turn. You're not going to vomit out Christia turn 1. But with that being said, Christia is a pretty good card, and this deck does have a very favorable matchup versus Blackwings, I would say. Now, the equalizing thing for Blackwings is Deck Devastation Virus, but if Blackwings don't have Deck Devastation Virus, this deck will just run crazy on you. Honest can run over Kalut. Shining Angel can summon Consecrated Light, so if Shura runs over it, you summon a Consecrated Light and they don't get to summon a something off Shura. Dimensional Alchemist trades with Shura. Orange Herald can counter Kalut. They can play Royal Decree. Christia, Consecrated Light, Honest, those are very problematic cards. Now, this deck is nowhere close to S tier. I don't think it's viable tier, but it's definitely better than the almost viable. So maybe we did need the C tier. So we're going to make a new tier. We'll call it, we'll call it, what the fuck? Situationally viable. If you have a lot of fucking Blackwings at your locals, you can mix them up, bring some Decree Fairies, and yeah. Now, this deck does require good decision-making for a medium power level, so definitely worth learning other decks if you want to bring something to a large tournament. But hey, you want to dominate your locals, you can sometimes bring very pure. Fish OTK. Now, I was just complaining about fairies not having any kill pressure at all. This deck has kill pressure. It runs on the Frog engine, and the main advantage of this deck is that it will catch your opponents off guard. They're going to think, oh, it's frogs. I don't have to worry about dying, and summon Coelacanths, bingo, bango, poo, poo, pew, and you're dead. Once the jig is up, this deck does lose to Blackwings pretty badly. Its slow start hands are extremely slow, and basically anything that runs frogs is going to be inviable tier, because frogs are that good. Flamvel. Now, this deck isn't commonly seen, but Flamvel Firedog is a pretty decent card in the format. The problem with this deck is the other cards. You will often brick with this deck, and it has one of the worst frog matchups in the game. Your deck was like reverse engineered to be as weak to frogs as possible. Like, it does have a decent matchup versus some of the viable decks, and even versus Blackwings, funnily enough. So I could say that this is situationally viable. So yeah, if you don't have frogs in your locals, like, you can play this. Frog Burn. This is one of Raunach's inventions. His name is spelled like this, but it's pronounced like whatever the fuck. I don't know if I said it right.
Raunach.
But yeah, this was one of his 1 million gimmick decks. The thing with his decks, they're S tier while he has the element of surprise. Once you see the list, it's like it loses viability. Now, this deck has definitely performed well in a few tournaments. It relies on Turbo Cannon. You protect it for a turn. Burn, 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 burn. You're going to brick on the defensive traps. And I do love traps. Funnily enough, this is the deck that got me to switch to frogs. I like the idea of protecting frogs with traps, situationally using Treeborn, and yeah, it's not as one-dimensional as original Frog Monarchs. Frog Combo is an unhealthy deck for the format. Nobody likes to play versus it. If you don't know what it is, the goal with this deck is to basically create an infinite loop and pray that they don't have DD Crow. It's a very fragile combo deck, and it's a nightmare to play against because of how long it takes. Now, the reason why there's turn limits in online tournaments is because of this deck. If your combo gets interrupted, you're in a very tough spot. So far we have 1, 2, 3, 4 different versions of frogs. They're all in viable tier. Frog Monarch. Now, the original Frog Monarchs, I say, were not well built. You were limited to 1 summon a turn, and if that summon got stopped with pulling the rug, you would often just take a bunch of damage and lose the game. They were not built to win versus Value Turbo. Now, recently, people have been experimenting with new cards. Fishborg Blaster, Pot of Avarice, for instance, have made the deck a much different animal. Now, there's a lot higher skill ceiling than, summon 1 Monarch a turn. I do think that there's a lot of different variants of Frog Monarch that can still be made. I've been experimenting with it myself. So if you were to include Synchro Frogs into Frog Monarchs, this deck has won 2 Ultimate Time Wizards, I believe. So yeah, large tournaments. And I do believe that regular Frog Monarchs can also do well, even without the Synchro package. But yeah, yet to be seen, but I do see the potential in it. Gemini. Now, this deck isn't commonly seen, but it is a threatening deck. Do not sleep on this deck. This is like a combo version of Hero Beat. This deck can randomly OTK you, but the thing holding it back is the brick hands with all monsters. If you don't have your traps, you are playing a deck with full vanillas. This has potential to be further refined and can maybe even contend with the S tier decks. Not many people play this deck, and the ones who do are pretty proficient with it. GB Combo. Now, GB keeps a lot of the decks in the format in check. It has a very good matchup versus some of the S tier decks and a lot of the viable decks, but it will randomly get FTK'd by a Cyber Dragon, so something to keep in mind. A lot of people will live by this deck and die by this deck, and it does see tournament success, so definitely not something to sleep on. I will put this in viable. Gladiator Beast Pure, so you're only allowed to play Glad Beast, but I'm pretty sure the one that won a tournament had Iatos. I'll assume Gladiator Beast Pure means only Gladiator Beast monsters. Grave Keeper. This deck is hilarious, but it kind of sucks. You will sometimes FTK people, but you don't have the sack potential, and frogs are very prevalent in the format. This has an atrocious matchup versus frogs, so we'll put this in almost viable. It can randomly do good versus Blackwings with all the Starlight Roads and Gravekeeper Spy, which is pretty fucking funny. You might see this like every now and then. Hero beat Stun. Now, I don't think that this would have a winning matchup versus any of the S tier decks. It will definitely mess up a lot of the viable decks. Would I rather have this over any of the other viable decks? Probably not, so I'm going to put this in either situationally or almost viable. If I want the skill drain deck, I'm not sure if I would want to play this instead of something else. I mean, maybe it is the best skill drain deck, who knows? Yeah, almost viable for online tournaments. In a local tournament, like sure, this can be situationally. Like all hero beat decks, it has the same problem of bricking on all monsters, bricking on all spells and traps that you can't use, dead miracles, dead Gemini Spark. Skill drain's good, and hilariously enough, this is one of the best decks you can play versus GB, so if everybody plays GB, this is what you bring. Frog Hero. Now this is a deck that has won a decent chunk of tournaments. Among the frog decks, this deck does the best versus gladiator beasts because of the hero package. Another strength of Hero Frog is that it discourages over-aggression. See, with Frog Monarchs, you're encouraged to just dump out your whole hand and try to FTK them as fast as possible. Whereas Frog Hero, if your push doesn't go through, your board gets wiped by an absolute zero. So it's a very difficult deck to play versus. It's a very threatening deck. This is easily an S tier deck. Hopeless Dragons, I see a little Norlaris in there, so I'm going to assume it's like this deck, the pizza deck. Yeah, this deck is like casino coin flip. I'm not sure why you would play this unless you're trying to like troll people, troll my match, Christopher Columbus, but this is not a like Columbus level. This isn't a completely useless deck. You can randomly sack the shit out of people with Future Fusion, Dark Creator, and Bingo Bango, but the consistency is just not there. You don't have a winning matchup versus Value Turbo. I don't think you have a winning matchup versus Frogs. Yeah, if you're trying to win a tournament, I would not recommend this. Hopeless Value, funnily enough, this one won a European tournament, I believe, Ultimate Time Wizard, but I believe that this is pretty much the same thing as Hopeless Dragon. Maybe this is slightly better. Maybe this could be viable. I'm not sure. I don't play versus it enough. I would not want this versus S tier decks. Except Dragon Turbo. This deck would FTK Dragon Turbo, which is kind of funny. Fuck Dragon Turbo. Quacky Miro, while other decks are playing Dark Arm Dragon, you're trying to figure out how to keep your draw phase. What the fuck is this deck? Christiasorn. This is a frog player's worst nightmare. They have the speed of Lightsworn with the threat of Christia. This is a deck that will consistently take game ones versus frogs, which is pretty funny. Frog players lose sleep versus this deck. It also has a fantastic matchup versus Blackwings, Dragon Turbo, but the problem with this deck is consistency. This deck is the best deck in the format when you're high rolling. When you're low rolling, which is pretty often, you're pretty fucking useless. It also has a pretty weak matchup to Value Turbo, so if Value Turbo is in the meta, you don't want to be picking Christiasorn. If you're only playing versus frogs, you can definitely consider this or GB. I'd probably play this before I play GB. This deck is very fun to play. You will sack the shit out of people, but you'll also brick out of your goddamn mind. Definitely a viable deck. I do think that if this deck had slightly more consistency, it could be S tier. This deck will win a tournament eventually. Kuraz Field Control. Now, I remember seeing this deck like early on, and I was like so fucking confused why anybody would think that this is like remotely viable. You're basically focusing on making a Gear Dragon. Yeah, basically the gimmick of this deck is to make a few Gear Dragons, but you're doing all of this bricking just for your Gear Dragon to flop dead to a Bottomless or a Raikou. Like, yeah, I don't know. That's just, yeah, Dark Arm Dragon exists. There's better options. Lightsworn, 60 cards. Now, Ketchup on a Steak? Same thing. Like, Lightsworns are pretty fucking good. They can sack the shit out of you, but you're less likely to sack if you're putting in 20 more Ketchups on your deck. Like, I would put Lightsworns in viable, and why would you do this to yourself? Christopher Columbus. It's like, actually, you can win with this deck because of the lights, like because of the stake, you can win with this deck. Okay, this is the best Christopher Columbus deck because it can win versus S tier decks, but your consistency is just not there. Lightsworn Pure, like I said, you can sack the shit out of people, but your problem is consistency. Lightsworn will sometimes top tournaments. Its high rolls are just fucking oppressive. Machina Gear. So this is like with the Gear Dragons. Now, this deck actually has kill potential and you can use your Gear Dragons in a healthy way. This deck will often fall apart when its degen pushes get interrupted somehow. Like, it doesn't have enough gas to get through with missing pieces. But with that being said, this deck can randomly OTK you. And there's also a funny thing you can do with magical hats where you make some Gear Towns and summon a few Gear Dragons and randomly OTK. Yeah, it's not a consistent strategy, but yeah, if you want to have some fun, sure, play Machina Gear. Almost viable. Nah, this is just Machina Control. Now, this is adding tools that Machina needs. Hypster, Raiko, Caius are very good cards, very versatile. The Swiss Army knife of Edison. And you're adding it to Machina so you can deal with the back row threats and then summon, attack. This is a viable deck, and I believe it just won a Ultimate Time Wizard. So yeah, congrats to Machina Control. Machina Gadget. This deck will sometimes get top 8 at a local tournament, but I do not see this deck making top 8 at a big tournament. One of the worst frog matchups in the game, but yeah, it can randomly overwhelm decks with the gadgets reproducing themselves. Quick Draw Machine. Quick Draw is one of the weakest decks in the format, I would say. Pretty much every side card is good versus Quick Draw, hilariously enough. And I believe with Machines, you're adding even more DDV targets, even more weakness to Royal Oppression. Why would you ever consider playing this deck if you're trying to win a tournament? Quick Draw Plant. Now, this deck fixes some of the weaknesses of Quick Draw, but Quick Draw is Quick Draw. It doesn't have any early game kill threat, and it doesn't have the potential to sack, nor do I think it has as consistent of a power level as any of the other decks in the viable category. We're going to put this in almost viable. Quick Draw Volcanic is very similar. You play Volcanic Rocket, so that's pretty cool itself, but I would never think that this is the best option to play for a tournament. Rescue Cat. No. Six Samurai. Now, this deck has sack potential, hilariously enough, so it's better than Christopher Columbus, but it is pretty hard to consistently sack people. Maybe somebody can figure out how to make Samurai valuable, but yeah, you could definitely argue that it's in one of these two tiers. Twilight Lightstorm, yeah, Cat's better, but yeah, we'll organize it later. Twilight Lightstorm, I'm not sure why people would consider, I guess if you're trying to like Omega sack people, but yeah, this is the deck that plays Dark-Armed Dragon, and yeah, I guess you can definitely ruin somebody's tournament run, but are you going to win a tournament with this? Probably not. Could you win a tournament with Gravegear? I mean, realistically, of the almost viable and Christopher Columbus deck, which one is going to win a tournament? Yeah, it's like the Lightstorm bricks, but you're messing up your mills. I guess you can play Chaos Sorcerer, Dark-Armed Dragon, if that's important to you. Thing with this deck is it will take games off of S-tier decks just because of the sackiness of it, but this deck is not as consistent as any of these decks, I would say. I would actually put this in Christopher Columbus. Vayu Turbo. Of the Edison decks, this is the hardest one to counter. This is the Swiss Army knife of Edison. It can play some of the best traps in the format. Everybody thinks that they have a winning matchup versus Vayu Turbo, but they lose to Vayu Turbo, and this will often win tournaments. Of the S-tier decks, I'm pretty sure this has won the most. Don't quote me on that. This is easily an S-tier deck. Vayu Turbo is not going anywhere anytime soon. The one losing matchup I'd say it has is Frogs, but even versus Frogs, it's not like a blowout. It can definitely, punch back versus Frogs. Well-a-dad. This is zombies with extra bricks, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, you play like the psychic shits. Would I say that this is situationally viable? Probably not. I think that zombies are pretty weak in of itself, and this doesn't fix any of the problems. That being said, it definitely has more consistency than some of the Christopher Columbus decks. I could put it in almost viable. X-Saber is, yeah, they're missing a lot of tools. People who play a lot of X-Sabers tell me that it's not good, but you will also see X-Sabers do some toxic things. Maybe somebody can figure it out. I'll say almost viable because it has sack potential. I guess if you have sack potential, we can move these up. Zombie Hero. The Jake Exo Special. This is the explosive version of Diva Zombie. You play Malicious, you can sack with Future Fusion. Basically, it's a very speedy version of Zombie. It's like Diva Hero except with zombies cards, honestly. Very good combos, very high ceiling deck, but it doesn't have the best matchup versus Blackwings. It's weak to DDV, it's weak to Royal Oppression, and sometimes DD Crow. DD Crow isn't the worst, but yeah, it will sometimes lose to common Blackwing hate cards. Definitely a viable deck. Instant Zombies, this is the Fitz special. Just like Zombie Hero, it's a different cookie, but I think that they're very similar in power level. I wouldn't say that one is like definitively better than the other because, yeah. Zombie Stun, I believe this is the zombie variant that plays Zombie World, Paladin of White Dragon, multiple Zombie Masters. It's basically like an aggro deck that doesn't know what the fuck it's trying to do. Gemini, for instance, the pieces combo, this one is like you're trying to steal random vanilla monsters that you sometimes run over. This is a pile of shit. And this is our final tier list. We added some clarification for almost viable. Top two tiers are in no particular order. It's all rock, paper, scissors between them. Everything below that is in order. I would play Six Samurai before I play Quick Draw. S tier decks will win tournaments the most frequently. Viable decks can win tournaments, but not as frequently. Shout out to Dat Jinja for harassing me to make this. Like, comment, subscribe. Let me know which video you want me to make next. Peace.